and draft minutes. Sorry. This meeting will be held electronically. The recording and draft minutes will be posted to the KCCA website on June 17th, 2021. The meeting will be streamed live at the following link. Recording notice, board members, staff, guests, and members of the public are reminded that the full authority / committee meeting is being recorded and will be posted to the authority's website along with official written minutes. As such, comments and opinions expressed may be published, and comments expressed by individual board members, guests, and general public are their own and do not represent the opinions or comments of the full authority and KCCA board of directors. The recorded video of the full authority meeting is not considered the official record of that meeting. The official record for the full authority meeting shall consist solely of the minutes approved by the full authority. Any declarations of pecuniary interest? Seeing none, we'll move down to item A, minutes of the meeting for May 19th, the full authority. Any errors or omissions?
Mr. Chair, sorry, can we do a roll call before we give that?
Go ahead.
Sure. Dennis Krebitz.
Here.
Dominique Giguère.
Present.
Stephen Harvey.
Here.
Jim Herbert.
Here.
Grant Jones.
Here.
Bill Mackey.
Here.
Steve Peters.
Here.
Elizabeth Pelosa. Allison Warwick.
Here.
Ralph Winfield. Mr. Chair, we have 8 of 10 members present.
Thank you. So we'll go back to the minutes of the meeting for May 19th. Any errors or omissions? Seeing no errors or omissions, may I have a mover and a seconder to adopt?
Herbert will move.
Herbert. Seconder.
Warwick.
Warwick.
Warwick. Great. Call the vote, please, Elizabeth.
Dennis Krebitz.
Yes.
Giguère.
Yes.
Harvey.
Yes.
Herbert.
Yes.
Mackey.
Yes.
Peters.
Yes.
Pelosa. Elizabeth. Yes, I heard you come in. Allison Warwick.
Yes.
And Ralph Winfield's absent. Grant Jones.
Yes.
And that motion passes.
Thank you. We'll move down to matters arising. Item A, June media report from Betsy. Go ahead, Betsy.
Mr. Chair, Betsy is just making her way home from the ministerial announcements. So I'll handle the next couple of reports until she's able to join us. It's been another busy month for staff. We onboarded a number of our new seasonal staffs in terms of opening the campgrounds for stage 1 opening for our transient and overnight campings and day use for June 14th. Betsy's been working on Lake Erie Student Summit with the Thames Valley District School Board. It's a great way to connect students with personal connections with Lake Erie. And we finished up our tree planting season as well, with well over 30,000 trees being planted by the crew this year. Despite the warm start to the spring season, the trees are went into ground, and we expect good survival rates as well. So we'll bring a staff report back in future months about the survival rate of our tree planting this season. Next slide. We have released a request for quote for the flood hazard mapping project down in Port Stanley, and we mentioned that last month that we got 50% funding for that. Betsy's been at work with the virtual water festival as well, with some key videos and follow-up activities going out to teachers in absence of a face-to-face water festival again this year. The campgrounds did open for overnight and day use on June 14th, which was welcomed by the public, and we've hired the additional staff to make that happen. And we've installed the dock and benches along the Dalewood Reservoir for the Evans Sisters Water Trail, and that is being well used as well. And next slide. As you're aware, Grant and I participated in a minister's announcement about funding for Ducks Unlimited to create wetlands across southwestern Ontario. This is great news, especially for the Kettle Creek watershed, where we have about 2% wetland cover. And as you're all aware, we worked with Ducks Unlimited to create 3 wetland cells by the office, and hopefully soon, when we're able to meet face to face, you'll be able to come out to the office and see these creations for yourself. But here's a bird's eye view of the cells. The picture on the left of the screen are the 2 larger cells further back in that buck field, and the picture on the right is the cell closer to Ferguson. You can see the cell closer to Ferguson is where we held the announcement this morning, and it's already holding water, which is great news. And the last report, Mr. Chair, if I can, the June watershed conditions. The water levels throughout the watershed are lower than normal. Lake Erie remains higher than normal, but relatively stable. We are moving ahead with that Port Stanley mapping project, and Jennifer was able to secure almost $10,000 in funding from DFO to continue municipal drain classification this summer. So that was welcome news for that program as well. And then I think I just have one final update, and that's for our August meeting. Usually we do an August meeting as required. It is in the schedule for August 18th. I have received word from the City of London that they would like draft budget numbers for August 11th with board approved submission by August 25th. So I'm just gauging this morning whether the members are able to meet on August 18th. That would allow me the opportunity to meet those budget timelines for the City of London. I know that Elizabeth has already indicated that I believe she's unable to attend an August 18th meeting. I just want to make sure that we have quorum if we move ahead with that meeting.
How's everybody's schedule look? I believe I'm okay for that day.
Yeah. Mr. Chair, through you, I think it overlaps with AMO conference.
And I'm attending AMO as well.
I am attending as well.
And Kravitz will be attending as well.
Okay, Mr. Chair, through you to members, is that conference that entire week, or could we schedule something else in that week?
Do you have the dates in front of you, Dominique?
It's until the Wednesday, so we could potentially consider Thursday or Friday.
Thursday.
Okay, Mr. Chair, I'll send out a doodle poll with Thursday and Friday, and then maybe one other date for the week prior to that week, and we'll choose the one that meets the majority of members. That's okay.
Okay. I'll start with that.
So unless there's any questions on those reports, we'd ask for a motion that all those staff reports be received.
Peters.
Here's seconder.
Mackey.
Mackie, any further discussion? Call the vote, please, Elizabeth.
Kravitz,
Yes.
Jaguar,
Yes.
Harvey,
Yes.
Herbert,
Yes.
Mackey,
Yes.
Peters,
Yes.
Pelosa,
Yes.
Warwick,
Yes.
Jones,
Yes.
and that motion passes, Mr. Chair.
Dennis, you have your hand raised. Do you want to?
Oh, just for the meeting on the Wednesday, the AMO conference is over at noon on the Wednesday. Just wanted to give you a heads up on that for the doodle poll.
Okay,
Thank you. Okay, we'll move down to correspondence. First one from Minister of Natural Resources regarding Section 39 transfer payments. You want to highlight anything, Elizabeth?
Mr. Chair, other than it's just good news that our Section 39 transfer payment has been confirmed in the same amount as last year. And it's welcome news that we did receive WECI funding again this year, so staff will be proceeding with those 2 projects outlined in the budget for maintenance of the Dealwood Dam, as well as concrete repairs on the dam as well. So, all good news.
Okay, any questions? Not, I need a motion to, recommendations that correspondence be received. Mover second, please.
Herbie will move it.
Herbert,
Harvey?
Harvey. Call the vote, please.
Cravitz,
Yes.
Jagger,
yes,
Harvey,
Yes.
Herbert,
Yes.
Mackey,
Yes.
Peters,
Yes.
Pelosa,
Yes.
Warwick,
Yes.
Jones.
Yes.
And that motion passes, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. We have nothing for revenue and expenses, so move down to new business. First item is regulatory proposal phase 1 under the CA Act. Elizabeth's taking this one.
Mr. Chair, I have a fairly, I'll try to keep it concise, but there is a lot of material to go through in terms of this report, and I want to make sure that members have the information. I am willing to stop, I guess, at various points throughout the presentation if the members have specific questions about each section. So I'll pause periodically and entertain those questions. The regulatory proposal, the phase 1, was posted for 45-day consultation period on the ERO. Comments are due on June 27th. It is a consultation guide on developing the regulations, so not the regulations themselves. Those will be forthcoming. Conservation Ontario is preparing collective agreements for all of the CAs, and that will be considered at the upcoming council meeting on Monday. But municipalities and individuals are welcome to submit their own comments as well. Staff have participated in a number of webinars that were offered by the ministry, and I believe your municipalities were offered that ability as well. CAs also have entertained doing some smaller discussions with smaller CAs throughout the province, as well as Southwestern GMs have had meetings and discussions on the draft regulations or the consultation guide. I also did send out preliminary comments to member municipalities, just recognizing the tight timeline from our meeting and the submission deadline. I provided some preliminary draft staff comments to member municipalities just to alert them to the posting and to begin letting them think about possible comments that they want to have back on it. There are 3 main sections to the consultation guide. The first part deals with the programs and services delivered by CAs, and they've been grouped mainly into 2 categories, mandatory and non-mandatory. And then there's the governance and oversight section, which looks at the municipal agreements that will have to be developed for the non-mandatory program delivery, the transition period that's required in developing those, and the community advisory boards that are being required to be set up by each CA. And the last part is other regulatory matters, and the big section there is updating, consolidating section 29 for the conservation areas regulations. Yet to be released is the levy regulation and standards for the delivery of non-mandatory programs and services. And I would suggest that there's probably 3 main overarching comments or concerns. There's certainly some wins in this consultation guide, but overall there are, I think, some concerns about capacity and the tight timelines that are being requested by CAs and our member municipalities. Restraints in terms of financial resources and possible addition of additional mandatory programs. And the unknown of some of the factors. So we're not reviewing the actual regulations, they're yet to be released, and there's a number of other regulations that are yet to be released that I believe we should have the benefit of looking at the entire package so we get the full picture. If I can have the next slide. So our current levy structure is basically to levy all member municipalities, and you're aware that you charge the levy based on the current value assessment. We do have the ability to levy a sole municipality for a certain project, and we also can go out to our member municipalities for fee for service. And a good example of that one would be the dog park. So we provide that service to Central Elgin St. Thomas through an agreement. The new levy structure basically looks at 2 categories of programming. Mandated program, which is outlined within the consultation guide, and we can levy all our municipalities in the same way that we do now without an agreement to deliver those programs. And then the other category of programs is what non-mandatory programs and services, and this will require a municipal agreement to use levy to deliver those programs and services, and cannot be done without an agreement, but we can use other sources of revenue to deliver those programs and services. Next slide. So just to walk you through that first part of the consultation guide that deals with the mandatory programs and services. And again, this is the programs that we would be able to levy for without an agreement, similar to how we do operate now. Currently, KCCA receives about $61,000 for mandated programs, and this includes flood forecasting, dams, and administration. What is being proposed in the consultation guide lays out the mandatory programs under natural hazards. And these include Section 28 permitting, plan input and review, flood forecasting and warning, operation and maintenance of flood erosion control structures, and communications around those programs. By the check marks in that chart, you can see that those are programs and services that I believe the authority is currently offering and levying municipalities for. But there's some programs within this bucket that aren't currently being offered by Kettle Creek, and it's mainly due to because we don't have the funding to do those programs. And they would include ice management services, the low water response program, and to a certain extent, the collection and management of hazard information. So quite typically, put a caution sign there, is that we would gear those types of things to available resources and our local needs. I think the real question about this consultation guide is whether we're required to deliver all of these mandatory services, or whether we're still able to work with our local member municipalities and look at our need on the local landscape as to determine whether we offer those services. The low water response one is one I've highlighted in the comments specifically because the funding from the province was pulled from that program in 2019. And at the time, the province said the authority could continue to offer it locally, but the board made the decision not to do that without funding support and chose not to basically download that program to the member municipalities. So we haven't been doing that program since 2019, and there is a board motion not to continue that program until funding is returned. Next slide. The other grouping of mandatory programs and services falls under the heading Management of Conservation Authority lands. And again, this is all lands that are owned by the CA. Right now, we have significant areas, so you think of Kirk Cousins, Dan Patterson, that we protect and conserve. The significant components of that is that conservation lands are a natural heritage feature. What we don't have, or we currently aren't offering under this, would be we don't currently have management plans for each property. This is a new requirement that would be brought on board with these new regulations. We don't currently enforce Part 1 offenses under the Provincial Offences Act on these properties. We normally work by issue identification and refer any matters to the Ontario Provincial Police. And mapping and assessment and repairs of these lands, again, are scaled to available resources. And so a lot of certainly the capital expenses we deal with by generating the revenue from our campgrounds and using that in these areas to offset capital expenses. So there's a little bit of caution here in terms of added expenses being added to this bucket. Certainly monitoring enforcement would be seen as an increased cost if we're expected to deliver to a certain standard. And again, the identification, the mapping and asset management under this, would we be able to levy municipalities for that where we haven't necessarily levied to a great extent the municipalities in the past. Next slide. And so I think another thing to highlight under this bucket list is that the consultation guide implies that the management of conservation authority lands with no recreation would qualify as a mandatory program if we could levy the municipalities for. But lands with any element of recreation, whether it's just a parking lot and a trail, would be classified as non-mandatory. We wouldn't be able to levy municipalities for those programs and services offered at that area. This could result in there's definitely been an increased use of demand from the public of our CA owned lands. And there's always been an assumption that a conservation area must provide access to the public. And I think moving forward, it would be difficult to separate and assign costs to shared resources such as this. And so we've had some discussion in the past about if one of these lands is located in one municipality, but used by the entire watershed, what happens if one municipality decides not to contribute to the recreation side of that conservation area lands. And to a certain extent, I think that we could continue to operate the way that we do now and that this wouldn't impact the municipal levy. But there is that caution that I've included in our comments that we would recommend that passive recreation be included in that mandatory activity on conservation authority lands. That passive recreation on CA-owned lands is a cost-effective means of reducing encroachment and other legal activities. So this is something that we've definitely experienced down on properties like Dan Patterson Conservation Area before we were charging people. We had a permit system down there, and we're running into encroachment and unsavory activities happening on the property, and we decided a number of years ago that perhaps a better way to look at it is to invite the public there, make it more easy for them to access those lands. And we saw those illegal activities basically level off because more legitimate users were using those properties. Next slide. The other grouping of mandatory programs and services is source water protection. Again, the caution I would have here is many of this service is fully funded by the province at this time, but there's always been concern and just a level of hesitation that we need to have this program fully funded by the province moving forward, that this is not a program that we want to see moved entirely to municipal levy. The thoughts in the past and always has been that the source water protection program should be 100% funded by the province moving forward. Next slide. And the final category of mandatory programs and services will be prescribed in regulation within 1 year after the end of the transition period, moving into municipal agreements. And this looks at the core watershed-based resource management strategy. And so this is a strategy that will be required by each CA to be developed and looks at how the resources of the local watershed should be managed for the best benefit of the watershed and community in terms of natural hazards. And it also includes the buckets of the provincial water quality and quantity monitoring network. And again, a slight caution here, the management strategies would be something that hasn't been undertaken, isn't currently being undertaken by the authority. I think it's a good step forward. It's needed locally. But again, especially for a smaller CA, we would look for direction from the province, just how involved those strategies can be. It's something that we need to go out to have a consultant hired to do. That gets very expensive. But certainly if it's something that we can use existing documentation for and build a strategy around, such as our watershed report cards, every cycle of the municipal councils, the staff here look at strategic work plans to basically look at what programs and services we can deliver with the funding that we have for the benefit of the municipality. So hopefully there's some flexibility there with the province to scale these strategies to our local resources, not to burden the municipalities any more than they are. And also a recognition that that provincial water monitoring network has been funded by the province in the past. we'd be again looking for the province to continue that funding so that that program isn't transferred to entirely to municipal levy. Next slide. And so basically the recommendations that I've included in the draft letter to the ER posting seeks that clarification in terms of clarifying if the regulation will require conservation authorities to deliver all mandatory programs, or whether we still have that input from our board members to gear those to our local capacity. And a clarification that MECP will continue to be fully funding the provincial water quality monitoring programs, as well as the source water protection program, and that we would strongly encourage the transfer of payment for the natural hazards program to stay at the current level or be reinstated to the 2019 levels. And finally, that the completion of the required documents, such as that strategy plan, the strategy and the conservation lands management plan for each CA, be phased in similar to requirements under the AODA, where smaller CAs may have a longer opportunity to phase those in. This will ensure that the larger CAs have the capacity can meet the timelines the minister has provided, but smaller CAs such as ourselves with less capacity and resources would have more time to complete these tasks. I'll just pause there to see if there's any questions on the mandatory programs and services bucket before I move on.
Any questions for Elizabeth? Not seeing any. You can continue.
Okay, next slide. So the non-mandatory services, this moving forward would require us to negotiate an agreement with our member municipalities. I think there's some flexibility that the ministry has identified within this regulatory proposal, in that it looks encouraging that we would be able to have one agreement with multiple member municipalities rather than going out and negotiating an agreement with each member municipality. And this would include, those agreements would include anything that the CA deems to be advisable. So this would include like tree planting, their stewardship program, environmental education program, but also services that the municipality is requesting of the CA. So things like the Kettle Creek Dog Park. To a certain extent, I think the stewardship program is already self-funded. A tree planting program would definitely fall in this category, but I would hope that our member municipalities definitely see the value in our tree planting program as a way to mitigate natural hazards that we deal with on the local landscape, particularly erosion. And to a certain extent, our environmental education program, again, is self-funded. And certainly our larger recreational program in terms of the campgrounds is self-funded as well. The actual municipal agreements will need to set out the amount that is being requested by the member municipalities, specify the termination date of the agreement, include provisions for terminating it, and must be publicly available on our website. Next slide. This is where we get into the timelines for these agreements. By the end of this year, BCAs are expected to have an inventory of all our programs and services and identify which bucket those programs and services fall into, whether they're non-mandatory or mandatory, and consult with our member municipalities on that listing and begin to develop a transition plan to support the creation of those municipal agreements. So there is a significant amount of work to be done there, and I want to have meaningful communication and consultation with our member municipalities. And then throughout 2022, we would be required to report back to the province on a quarterly basis on our efforts to transition to those on our transition plans and moving forward. And then with the aim that by December 2022, we would have those agreements in place, and the 2023 budgets would reflect those agreements and the new funding model. So again, it's encouraging that the minister looks like they will be allowing the completion of one agreement for multiple municipalities. I think this is an efficient use of resources, and it makes sense locally to still maintain that watershed perspective of our programs and services. Next slide. The minimum levy, this consultation guide speaks to this. It's not been released or really discussed in length in the consultation guide. It will be it will be included in more detail in phase 2, which is expected out later this year. This will allow the authority to fix a minimal amount as to the portion of the Conservation Authority's operating expenses, and you can see on the slide some of the examples that are included in the consultation guide. Some questions around this, we don't have the full details. I think there's some questions as to whether this minimal levy will apply to mandatory programs and services and non-mandatory or overarching for both of those programs and services. So there's definitely more questions that we would have there. And I think it's an important element that we have answers to those questions before we go out and have those discussions with our member municipalities, that we have a whole picture of this levy regulation and the possibility of this minimal levy moving forward. Next slide. So the recommendations in terms of the bucket for the non-mandatory programs and services and around those timelines is that KCCA supports that flexible agreement arrangement with member municipalities, that we would recommend that the minister, certainly we would support the minister allowing to grant an extension for completing those municipal agreements where an authority has one or more member municipalities submit a written request to the minister. And that in order to meet those timelines that the minister has established, that we would strongly recommend that the regulations be finalized as soon as possible, that any delay in finalizing those regulations, and especially in seeing that levy regulation, would make it difficult to achieve those timelines, and that the province work with CAs and possibly Conservation Ontario to prepare sample strategies and management plans and provide training on how existing documents might be used to fulfill the intent of the regulation. Again, as a small CA, we want to make this transition, but I think we do need to have the recognition that it will put stress on a small staff, and we want to be able to accommodate as well the possible restrictions of our member municipalities. And I'll pause there for if there's any questions on that section.
Any questions go ahead, Bill.
Yep. Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, to Elizabeth, just an administrative question. Is Conservation Ontario working on like a generic template for the agreement? And I'm thinking of, say, a municipality that might have 3 different CAs in its boundary, so would have the same kind of agreement for all 3 of them as opposed to different agreements for different authorities?
Through you, Mr. Chair, to Bill, yeah, those discussions are starting to happen, and certainly I think Conservation Ontario and the CAs will be very busy over the summer period trying to pull some existing templates that might exist on the landscape right now. I'm really pleased to say that the Southwest CAs have talked about coming together for basically forming a working group, again, to share some of these, to work together, to identify templates that we need and to share resources amongst ourselves. I think it's Middlesex Centre, I think they share 5 CAs. And so the CAs have already recognized, especially with that municipality, that we want to make it easy for everyone to negotiate these agreements and share resources where we can.
Thank you. Sounds like you're already way ahead on all this. That's great. Thanks.
Question from me, Elizabeth. Being from Middlesex Centre, I have a bit of a question on the negotiation part of this, and the fact that those municipalities are going to be expected to negotiate 5 different agreements. And at what point do we get into negotiating costs, so to speak? And what if one municipality or one CA has a different price for a program than another CA? Has there been any thought put into those standardizations of costs at all?
Mr. Chair, to Steve's question, I don't have a good response to that. I don't think there has. I attended a meeting yesterday. Some CAs some of the larger CAs have gone out, are beginning to go out and getting a consultant to look at a review of their fees and making sure that the fees in their program areas are matching the costs of those programs. So there's some fee service reviews happening that I'll be trying to pull some more information on. But in terms of different programs, the cost of different programs for each CAs and how you negotiate that, we haven't delved into that too much. I don't think it's any different than, it's not any different, but that exists already in terms of the levy that municipality would give to those CAs. I think that's part of the discussion that happens with your budget presentation to those member municipalities. I'm sure there's already services that Middlesex Centre is perhaps working with St. Clair on that aren't offered at Kettle. But in terms of shared programs and how we set fees or levy for those in terms of municipalities that are sharing service with CAs, I haven't delved into that, and certainly that will be something that we'll be looking at over the summer.
Okay, thank you very much.
Go ahead, Jim.
All right, well, yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, my question kind of rallies around what has already been mentioned, but I guess my concern would be you have a very aggressive agenda here, and it depends on cooperation with most of the conservation authorities. But what happens hypothetically if it's a 50-50 split, that some want to maintain their independence and do their own thing? Is this something that we could do independently in our conservation authority, or do we need to have support from the rest of the conservation authorities in Ontario?
No, Mr. Chair, to Jim, I think it very is a one-on-one kind of negotiation with Kettle and our member municipalities. I think where the resource sharing is that there would be templates on how to set up that agreement that we could use. But in terms of the negotiations of the programs and services, especially in the non-mandatory bucket, would definitely be a discussion simply between Kettle Creek and our member municipalities. But I think there is value in, again, using Middlesex as an example. We've already kind of reached out to that member municipality that, maybe those 5 CAs sit down with Middlesex staff and kind of identify how we want to move this forward so that it's not too onerous for the member municipality to negotiate these agreements that are going to be required.
Okay, thank you very much.
Any other questions?
Can I have the next slide then, Jessica? So the other requirement is that the conservation authorities will be required to establish community advisory boards. There's been some discussion amongst the CAs about the use of the name board on these community advisory boards. My understanding is that that is not a negotiable element here. That name has to be used. It was put in the legislation, and so they will need to be identified as community advisory boards, but I think there may be a workaround in terms of you could establish a local name for the committee so that there's no confusion between the community advisory board and the full authority board. So you, in your terms of reference that you developed for this committee, you would identify it as the Kettle Creek public committee, and in the terms of reference, recognize that it is meeting the requirements of the Community Advisory Board. Because I do think that is confusing to have a Community Advisory Board plus the Board of Directors. And this Community Advisory Board will be required. It's to provide advice and recommendations to the authority on strategic priorities, policies, and programs, discuss opportunities for coordination with other environmental initiatives, and really form a basis for community engagement. Next slide. This chart just sets out the board will be able to develop a terms of reference for this Community Advisory Board, and that's what I'm saying. You could choose to name it something else publicly, but meet the requirements of the Community Advisory Board. Certain things will be prescribed by regulation. The number of members, they're suggesting the minimum number of members is 5. You'll have to solicit membership across the watershed. They need to be a good geographic range throughout the watershed, and they'll have to conduct meetings in keeping with our administrative regulations. Packages posted on the website, a public appointment process. And there will also be a requirement for a minimum number of KCCA Board of Directors to also sit on this Community Advisory Board. Next slide. So there are concerns or certainly recommendations that I believe that the authority should pose back to the ministry. Mainly being that the function of this Community Advisory Board is to provide advice and recommendation to the authority on programs and services. I think we need to draw a distinction, or I would look for clarification on how or if there will be a distinction between mandatory and non-mandatory programs and services, and can the province provide clarification on whether the Conservation Authority Board of Directors will be required to accept or follow or implement the recommendations on the advisory committee. Certainly, again, as it pertains to those mandatory versus non-mandatory programs and services, that will have an implication on the municipal levy. I would suggest a recommendation is if we were required to form these community advisory boards, that the board of directors should be able to develop and approve the composition, the activity. So basically set that terms of reference so that we can scale it to our local watershed needs and our available resources. I would suggest that with a 10-member board, it seems a very large community advisory committee to have a minimum of 5 members. And so the suggestion from a number of smaller CAs is to suggest to the ministry that we could have 5 or 3, where a conservation authority has 10 or fewer municipally appointed board of directors. As a smaller CA, we might find it difficult to recruit and retain members for that large of a scale of the committee. And again, we have limited resources in terms of finances and staff. And I think also we want to be able to ensure that these community advisory boards are doing meaningful work. And then again, that the support of one or more municipalities, the CA be able to defer the establishment of the Community Advisory Board until 2023 to allow sufficient time for us to develop those transition plans and municipal agreements and work through this process before we also have to onboard this Community Advisory Committee. I'll just pause there in case there's any questions on the Community Advisory.
So I guess one concern I have they identified how often this advisory board has to meet? Is there a requirement there?
I don't believe so. I believe that's something that the terms of reference can establish.
Because you see this where obviously most likely you would be the representative from staff sitting on this. And as usual, most committees or boards rely on staff to do the work.
Right.
You're already busy. Questions?
I think I just have one final section. So the last section is on section 29, and section 29, historically, each CA has had their own regulation, and it pertains to what activities can and cannot happen on our Conservation Authority lands. The ministry is proposing to consolidate these into one regulation. I think that makes sense. The only warning I have here is that the CAs again not be required to enact Part 1 offenses under the Provincial Offences Act, but the tool exists for those CAs that choose to use it for the orderly and safe use of their properties. So some of the larger CAs will train their staff as Part 1 offense officers and go and ticket people in their conservation areas for not abiding by the rules and regulations. There's no financial benefit to CAs for doing that, so it takes a large amount of time and money to train provincial offenses officers, and then the income that would come from ticketing people doesn't come back to the authority. It goes to the municipalities. So in terms of the effort to be put in that, there's no benefit back from a smaller CA such as ourselves. We enforce rules and regulations on our properties by issue identification and working with the local police forces to do that.
But it seems that if we were required to do that, and a person that had been ticketed wanted to go to court and defend himself, we were required to hire a lawyer to do that.
And it would require staff time to go and defend it as well. So
And we're not getting money.
and we don't give them money back. I think there are some of the larger CAs that have really struggled with issues during the pandemic of unlawful activity on their properties, or perhaps will be advocating for this, but as a smaller CA with limited resources, we certainly don't. We recognize it might be a tool for larger CAs, but certainly not hopefully or for smaller CAs. And so if I could just have the next slide. So the recommendation from staff is that these draft comments be approved and submitted to the AR posting, and that we circulate them both to Conservation Ontario and our member municipalities.
Okay, any further questions, comments? Seeing none, so we have the recommendation before you. Gavin, mover and second, please.
Mackey moves.
And Kravitz, second.
Any further discussion? Call the vote, please, Elizabeth.
On the motion, Kravitz,
Yes.
Beer,
Yes,
Harvey,
Yes.
Herbert,
Yes.
Mackey,
Yes.
Peters,
Yes.
Pelosa,
Yes.
Warwick,
Yes,
Jones,
Yes,
and that motion passes, Mr. Chair.
thank you. Next item is Kettle Creek Clean Water Initiative. Is Betsy here? Or
She is on, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Betsy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we have another wetland creation project for you to review for funding through the Kettle Creek Clean Water Initiative. This project's actually on the property adjacent to the wetland that you approved last month. So you can see 2101 was the one approved in May. And this would look at doing a small excavation in an area that's already seasonally wet and open with wetland grasses already in there, but it's just enhancing its water holding capacity. The project cost of this is $7,500. So we would be looking for $3,000 from the Kettle Creek Clean Water Initiative. And other funders on this project are Ducks Unlimited and the Elgin Stewardship Council.
Any questions for Betsy on the report? So I need a mover and seconder for the recommendation consideration.
Warwick
Pelosa
moves.
moves.
Warwick and who's the other person?
Pelosa,
Rosa, any further discussion? Call the vote, please.
On the motion, Kravitz,
Yes?
Jiguer,
yes,
Harvey,
yes,
Herbert,
yes,
Mackey,
yes,
Peters,
Yes.
Pelosa,
yes,
Warwick,
yes,
Jones.
Yes.
And that motion passes, Mr. Chair.
Okay. We'll move down to item C, an update on Peacekeeper Park.
Mr. Chair, I wanted to give members an update today on the progress Peacekeeper Park has been making in terms of vacating the lands of Lake Whitaker Conservation Authority. Obviously, COVID-19 has delayed progress on site, especially in terms of the removal of buildings and facilities. Peacekeeper Park does have access to the property until December 31st, 2021. But staff have recently requested that in terms of planning and negotiating the removal of the buildings and large structures that Peacekeeper use a target date of November 15th, 2021 for the removal of those objects, just recognizing that it's summer now, but winter is coming, and removal of some of those large buildings and structures beyond November 15th will present challenges in terms of potential damage to the grounds due to weather. And we want to try to keep things on track to December 31st. Peacekeeper Park representatives have identified that they don't want to be held to any type of earlier target date than December 31st, but I have tried to stress to the board of directors and at Peacekeeper that we're not trying to change the December 31st deadline. We're just trying to recognize that we need progress to be moving forward, and especially in terms of the buildings and structures, that as they work with those removals, that they use November 15th kind of as a target date, that we would like those things done before that time. Peacekeeper Park has also been exploring relocation options with Lambton County. Lambton County is currently looking at possible land that may exist within the county, either from member municipality or a CA that would have vacant land or land that Peacekeeper could use to move to. They're taking 90 days to review that from June 2nd, and we'll come back to Peacekeeper with possibilities. If a location could be secured, then obviously the relocation of buildings and structures would be moved up to accommodate that move. Next slide. Discussions over the last month have, on June 3rd, KCCA staff did meet with members of Peacekeeper Park, and Peacekeeper Park advised at that time that they would like to leave the path of honor at Lake Whitaker CA and have KCCA fully maintain and upkeep the path. KCCA staff were a little surprised by that. Peacekeeper Park representatives believe that KCCA in December committed to fully maintain and upkeep the path moving forward. The motion that the board passed, the last part of the motion pertained to the path of honor, and it stated that KCCA offered to allow the path of honor to remain on Lake Whitaker CA lands, and that staff report back on how this may be accomplished. So next slide. So staff has been, KCCA staff have basically been waiting for Peacekeeper Park to identify whether or not they were interested in leaving the path of honor at Lake Whitaker. That only came on June 3rd. But again, Peacekeeper Park believes that the board committed to fully maintaining both financial and by volunteer services to upkeep that path of honor moving forward. They're really basing that belief on comments that were made by the chair to the press in December of 2020. And those quotes were included in the advance package. Next slide, please. In terms of, so basically staff are bringing this report back to the members today to seek direction. Certainly it's KCCA staff opinion that we were to work with Peacekeeper Park to come up with if they showed interest in leaving it on Lake Whitaker lands, that we would work with them to come up with an agreement about maintenance and upkeep moving forward. Again, Peacekeeper has indicated they want it left. They would like to leave it on Lake Whitaker lands, but believes that KCCA would take all responsibilities, both financial and otherwise, moving forward. Granted, I just thought I would give a few slides and backgrounds on the current condition of the Path of Honor. Granted, the Peacekeeper Park has not been able to go out and maintain the lands due to the lockdown. And the first picture on the screen shows the grass length around the Path of Honor. That again, I think is mainly due to their inability to get out on site during the lockdown. And I also understand that their lawnmower had some repair issues as well, that they weren't able to get out and do that type of maintenance. But grass cutting aside, the Path of Honor is showing wear, and it is in need of attention, certainly to bring it up to KCCA standards. So you can see this, the cross on the right, there's about 100 crosses on site now or more. And then if I can have the next slide, there's 12 what I would call display boards, and they detail peacekeeping missions. Some of those display boards are missing. Others are showing, basically I would describe it as heaving at the base, and repair is needed to those display boards as well. Next slide. The crosses are wooden crosses, and so they, again, are in need of repair and ongoing maintenance. They would need to be painted and the Canadian flag restored on a variety of them. Some are showing rot and wear at the base of the crosses as well. And again, so it represents a long-term maintenance cost, but also staffing resources or volunteer resources, which is my understanding is what Peacekeeper Park relied upon up until this point to maintain those crosses. Next slide. There are at least 2 memorial benches that are on the Path of Honor as well. Again, they are showing signs of deterioration, and certainly this wouldn't be in keeping with anything that the authority has on other properties. So it would be staff suggestion that they would be removed and taken with Peacekeeper Park. Next slide. Again, the memorials on KCCA land has not been something that we've entertained before. It was unique to the agreement that we had with Peacekeeper Park for the use of those lands. I can think of 2 occasions where the authority has put some type of marker on our property, and one of them was when we planted the 1,000th tree. We put some consideration behind basically a marker that doesn't require ongoing maintenance or a capital cost. And you can see from the picture here, basically what we landed on was a rock with an engraving that's easily mowed behind and doesn't require long-term maintenance. So the next slide, please. So included in the advanced packages is basically the staff are looking for direction from the board today, just for clarification on what your intentions was for Peacekeeper Park, the intention of the motion that we passed in December. So I believe in terms of an options analysis, there's probably 4 options that the board could direct staff to today. You could direct staff to maintain the Path of Honor on site with trail crosses and storyboards, and immediately look to budget staff resources and maintenance costs to bring it up to KCCA standards. I would make a staff suggestion that if that was the wish of the board, that only the existing storyboards be maintained and the memorial benches be removed by Peacekeeper Park. You could also direct staff to negotiate a maintenance agreement with Peacekeeper Park whereby the path of honor is allowed to stay on Lake Whitaker lands. The KCCA would maintain in terms of the grass cutting that's required around that path. However, Peacekeeper Park would be responsible for ongoing maintenance of the storyboards, crosses, and path, basically the capital costs and perhaps the volunteer efforts that would be needed to keep that moving forward. A third option would be direct staff to work with Peacekeeper to explore options for the removal of the crosses and look at a one-time expense, low maintenance option. Would represent less maintenance and financial resources for both parties, possibly similar to what was done for the Millionth Tree, and would be consistent with other properties and other things that we've done. And of course, in any option analysis, the fourth option would be to respectfully decline to continue the path of honor on Lake Whitaker skate lands if the intention of Peacekeeper Park was to not offer any financial or ongoing volunteer resources.
Questions or comments?
Question, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Jim.
Thank you. First of all, I think whatever we can do to keep this Peacekeeper or the Path of Honor up and running is something we should certainly take a serious look at. My question is with the mess hall. I noticed in the report, they said there was somebody maybe interested in the mess hall. So I don't think there's any thought of tearing the mess hall down. I happen to have the opportunity to be on a small tour. It's a well-constructed building and in pretty decent shape. So if I guess there's a two-part question. If somebody was interested in doing something with it, what is the responsibility for Kettle Creek to be involved with it? Or secondly, if nobody wanted to do anything with it, is the building just going to stand vacant and deteriorate and not be used? So those are my two questions. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, through Jim, in regards to the mess hall structure, it's my understanding that Peacekeeper Park does have an interested person or organization that is willing to take that building off site and move it to their own site. KCCA would not be involved in necessarily those negotiations. That's up to Peacekeeper to make those arrangements. I think from staff's perspective, we're just asking that where possible that Peacekeeper make sure those arrangements are being done before November 15th, because that's where we're concerned with moving large structures like that could be possibly impacted by winter weather and cause damage to the property as they remove it. So where possible, we're asking them to take advantage of better weather before they move those buildings. The second question, in terms of it being left on site, the agreement does state that Peacekeeper Park is expected to remove all of those items from the site, and they are working towards that goal.
Thank you. It's such a nice building for sure. But anyway, thank you very much.
Other comments? Go ahead.
Through the chair, to anybody really, I'm concerned how we came to this. I mean, I think Steve's comments were very well intended, well founded, but they weren't the comments of the board. And then we haven't really had a chance to sit down and discuss this with the board. I see those benches, and those benches are memorial benches that somebody has donated money to have Peacekeeper Park maintain the benches. So, you know, there's responsibilities there that people have paid for. And I'm not sure if those are our responsibilities or not. Then looking at the crosses and the plaques, I mean, the ongoing cost to those, is that something that is our responsibility to assume? I think as the board, we were trying to work with them, and we were trying to say, you know, this is a spot for you to keep your crosses and your path of honor. But I was not aware that we were going to continue to do that. I don't even know if we have the knowledge to support the path of honor. You know, it's more of a Peacekeeper Park project, and I'm not sure if it's a Kettle Creek Conservation Authority project. So I'm just a little bit disturbed at how we're supposed to keep on going and the lack of conversation we've had. So I'm just not sure how we're going to move forward from this.
Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And certainly as the mover of the original motion to allow the Path of Honor to stay on Lakewood or CA lands and that the staff report back of how this could be accomplished, I don't believe it was the board's intention to take on all financial responsibility, running the program, offering education history for it that the public might want, and assuming all those assets that would go with it and the maintenance, the repair, and the capital costs. As a CA, we're going through the discussions of, we just discussed mandatory programs that are legislated by the province and what isn't mandatory. And, you know, going back and asking member municipalities of funding somebody else's program that are alleged in the lands, to me, is quite questionable. Obviously, I support this Path of Honor, but never want to take over ownership and executing what their vision was for it. That's very personal to them with their whatever mission statement and their objectives were. The items, you know, we've just seen that they're not in great shape, and it's going to be how to assimilate that into what we do when it's not part of our plan of program offerings and things to the public. I think we were just simply trying to offer a space that this could be housed and the public would still have access to, and for a memorial. So I'll leave my comments there, but I was definitely not interested in taking on financial ownership or curatorship of this program for them. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Go ahead, Dennis.
But yeah, just gonna mirror what Elizabeth had just stated. As for the four options that are up on the screen right now, number one is definitely not something that is a core mandate of the Conservation Authority. So that one will be removed immediately from the discussion, I believe. And as far as the ongoing maintenance, it's not our mandate. It's not the core mandate of this board to have this Path of Honor. We offered to keep it on the premise, like in essence, but as far as where the discussion is going now, I think we should almost direct staff to have the removal of the Peacekeeper Park, or we could do a simple memorial like the 1 millionth tree. That would be my feeling. But as far as the ongoing cost and expense of maintaining this, we don't have the background, the history, and I don't think it's something that we should be exploring. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. Go ahead, Bill.
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair. I think I kind of agree with Elizabeth and Dennis. I'm not fond of number one, but also on the other end, I don't like number 4 either, because I think because it was there for so long, I would kind of favor number 3. It would be a solution, a final kind of solution with a one-time memorial, have a bit of input from Peacekeeper Park folks. Low maintenance, and but yet it's there and it commemorates the site. Yeah, I think I like the idea number 3 myself. Just my comments. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead, Steve.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Appreciate everyone's comments. I personally lean towards number 2. I think the grass cutting costs that would be assumed by the authority would have to be minimal. We're going to be cutting the grass in the area anyway. It allows the path to stay, but the onus is put on Peacekeeper to deal with the capital costs and the ongoing maintenance of it. And, you know, I lean towards 2, perhaps with an additional comment that this would be subject to an annual review by the authority, Kettle Creek Conservation Authority Board. I just think we've got a public relations nightmare on our hand if we deal with 3, if we move forward on 3 or 4. And I think at least for the short term, let's go with 2. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Go ahead, Dominique.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was going to say the same. I support number 2 as well. This is making the assumption that grass cutting, we're already cutting adjacent areas. So the impact, the cost would be minimal. So, and I think that would be a proper gesture, but beyond that, all the assets is beyond our core mandate. So we'd have to be very, very careful. So yeah, I lean toward number 2 with perhaps clarification from staff that this assumption about minimal cost is correct.
Thanks, Dominique. Elizabeth, did you have further comment? Your hand's still up.
Sorry, thank you, Mr. Chair. My concerns with number 2 is just realizing some of the financial struggles this organization's had in the past, and realizing if we want to have a PR nightmare, that's not how I make my voting decisions. I base it on policy. But if things fall into disrepair and we go with option number 2, it is going to still come back on the board of why are we so disrespectful to veterans to allow this to happen? And that's my concern with having items that are going to require ongoing maintenance if they're a wooden cross versus a permanent stone that could be low maintenance. So for me, 1 and 2 is out, just based on past experiences and budget concerns, realizing they will still fall on this board, and this conversation will be a reoccurring one for us, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So kind of going back and forth between 2 and 3, some members haven't commented yet. Any further comments? I guess personally, I'm leaning towards number 3 as well. I think that's the most reasonable going forward. Go ahead, Jim, and then Allison after that.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, it's been a good discussion, but I think I'm going to lean to number 2 because I think Councillor Peters made a good comment. Let's look at it for this summer, and then we could see what just is there much more than just cutting grass, and have a look at it at the end of the year. So I think that path of on is, and I'm new to this board, but I think the path of on has been there for a long time. I think it would be tough just to shut it right down. So anyway, both 2 and 3 are workable. I just think we should try it maybe one summer and just get a report back at the end of the summer, just what all the costs were, because they are cutting grass there. And if that's minimal right now, then it might work out. But anyway, thank you very much.
Okay. Go ahead, Allison, and Stephen after you.
I'm just unclear, Peacekeeper Park is going to remain on the land till December 31st. So all summer long, I mean, they should be responsible for any ongoing repairs, grass cutting. Like I'm not sure why we would be responsible for grass cutting when they're still going to be there until the end of the year. So I guess maybe staff can answer that, but I just not sure how this is going to work. Like they haven't left yet. So why are we worrying about taking care of it until we know if they've found another location or not?
Mr. Chair, to Allison, I can clarify that staff have worked out an agreement, a verbal agreement basically with Peacekeeper Park right now. We are undertaking grass cutting on certain segments of the land that are not in or around any of their assets. And they are responsible for the grass cutting and maintenance of those areas where their assets are on until December 31st, and that includes the Path of Honor at this point. So the staff's intentions or the direction from the board that we're looking for today is what we do after December 31st.
Okay, go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, I guess my thoughts, first of all, I can't add anything new to what people have said. I'm stuck between number 2 and number 3, but I do think that, as Steve said, we're into a political nightmare. It doesn't really matter what we do, but if we make an attempt to accommodate the Peacekeeper Park folks and then that falls through, then it doesn't necessarily fall completely back into our lap. And so negotiating some sort of an agreement with them for maintenance, I think is the first attempt. And if that doesn't happen, if they can't agree with us, then we go with number 3. But I think, we owe it to the veterans and to the whole essence of why it's there in the first place to try to accommodate it at this point in time, giving the folks from Peacekeeper Park the responsibility that they created when they created the Walk of Honor in the first place.
Sorry. Thank you, Stephen. Pretty much everybody has participated. So I guess I would have to ask somebody to make a motion for either 2 or 3, it looks like, and see where it goes. Oh, sorry, Steve. Peters, go ahead.
Well, Mr. Chair, I was going to move that recommendation number 2. Recommendation number 2 is the motion. I'm not going to reread everything, but I would move number 2.
Can I have a seconder for that motion?
Herbert will second it.
Herbert? Any further discussion on the motion?
Yes, Kravitz here.
Go ahead, Dennis.
With motion number 2, it says direct staff to negotiate a maintenance agreement. What if a maintenance agreement is not achieved? Where are we then? Are we back at this discussion next meeting?
Yeah, and I guess that's a good question. I was kind of mulling that over my head as well. And do we give staff the option of going to item 4 if all else fails? As part of the recommendation.
Well, Mr. Chair, as the mover of the motion, I would expect that if staff can't negotiate the agreement, that they would come back to us as a board, and that would be my preference. I wouldn't want to see us move 2 motions at once. Let's deal with one and see what the response is.
Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair. I think if we were to choose number 2, we'd have to be very specific with timelines, just because of the pictures that we've seen there today. There's a lot of work to be done, and actually right now it's in pretty poor shape. So I don't know if we would even be proud to have somebody walk through there right now with all that work to be done. So we'd almost have to have it brought up to speed or up to a certain level of certain level to actually have it maintained there. So that's going to be a bit of money, and there again, I don't know if the group would be willing to do that. So I just think that should be talked about if we were going to the level of maintenance of the area and what it looks like now if we were going to go with number 2. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Stephen, did you have something more to comment, or did your hand just stayed up from the last time?
No, sorry, I just didn't take it down. Sorry about that.
That's all right. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just my comments follow up to my fellow colleagues of just, if we're wording it that the Peacekeeper Park be responsible for ongoing maintenance and upkeep of the storyboards, crosses, and path, to make sure that it's clear that it's upkeep acceptable to KCCA standards versus upkeep in a state of disrepair. Worried about the public perception, and if funds aren't available, I understand it wouldn't be possible to upkeep them, but it's also a reflection on this board and how we allow our things to look. And wondering if through the process, Mr. Chair, that we're directing staff to negotiate a maintenance agreement with Peacekeeper Park. Is that agreement to come back to the board for final approval, or staff are authorized to enter into that agreement on behalf of the board? Just looking for clarification.
I have to assume that have to come back to the board for final approval, but I'll allow Elizabeth to.
Mr. Chair, it would be the intention of staff to bring it back for the approval of the board if we were able to negotiate an agreement.
Okay, that's my questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Well, go ahead, Allison. You're muted, Allison.
sorry about that. Thank you for acknowledging me. The only question I just want to bring everyone's attention to is this group is looking for a new location in Lambton County. And for them to come back in 2022 and maintain crosses in quite far away from where they're situated is just concerning to me again. So I'm just not sure how we have to define the ongoing maintenance for 2022 is going to be pretty strict and by, as Elizabeth says, our standards.
Okay, any further comments before I call the vote? So the motion is for item number 2, duly moved and seconded. Sorry, Elizabeth, did you have another comment?
A quick question, Mr. Chair, just recognizing that several board members have raised concern about the maintenance and now specifically learning that this group is locating farther away from us. Is it possible to ask for like an endowment fund, like a small annual fund that if they were unable to maintain things, that KCCA would have a small money from them to do it on their behalf if something happened, they couldn't physically do it themselves?
Is that something?
Mr. Chair, if the board wants to give that direction as part of the number 2 motion, I've made some notes that the board is concerned that the maintenance agreement recognize the upkeep is acceptable to KCCA standards. Steve mentioned earlier that a review be done on an annual basis. And I take Elizabeth's point now that to possibly look at the possibility of establishing a small annual endowment fund.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Dominique.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was going to say, I think even with an endowment, we're going down the path of taking responsibility that is not ours. It's not an issue of funding. In my mind, it's an issue of, this is not a core responsibility. So I think we just need to set the parameters in terms of standards, be very clear what the standards are in terms of aesthetic, safety, and whatever else, be very clear, because those standards can be very subjective. But that's it. That would be my recommendation. Leave the motion as is.
Thank you, Dominique. Go ahead, Dennis.
I was just going to state, with option number 3, politically, we're recognizing the Peacekeeper Park, the walk, and the Path of Honor. We can acknowledge recognition for it, and the state of disrepair of the current crosses and the benches and everything. It's an ongoing cost. If we were to have an agreement with them as far as us cutting the grass, you know, all of a sudden the crosses are being knocked over or something, it's going to come back on the board. I think number 3 is an option where politically we can recognize Peacekeeper Park. If they do relocate, we don't know the longevity of the Peacekeeper Park group. I just like that, take that into consideration on this vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. Any further comments? So I'll call the vote.
Mr. Chair, just can I ask from a staff's perspective, just so we have this, and maybe I'll ask the mover, Steve Peters, if it was the intention to move simply what is on the screen as number 2, or if it was the intention to move what is on the screen as number 2 with the addition of subject to an annual renewal by the board and upkeep acceptable to KCCA standards.
I would accept that as a friendly amendment.
Jim, are you fine with that as well?
Yes, I think that's good, because I think what we're trying to do now is just make sure that that piece, the Path of Honor, is taken care of. And this gives us lots of options at the end of the, starting next year or at the end of the year, to see what happens. So anyway, I'm still happy to support that. So thank you very much.
Dennis, your hand's up. Did you have another comment?
No, I didn't. Sorry.
Right, no problem. Okay, so you want to read the motion again, just for clarification for everybody?
I'll try. The motion would be to direct staff to negotiate a maintenance agreement with Peacekeeper Park, whereby the path of honor is allowed to stay on Lake Whitaker CA lands to be maintained by KCCA in terms of grass cutting. However, Peacekeeper Park is to be responsible for ongoing maintenance, including the storyboards, crosses, and path for capital costs. That the path, and further that the path be kept to KCCA standards, and the negotiated agreement be brought back to the board and be subject to an annual review by the board. I would finesse it a bit, but those are the elements.
Okay. I'll call the vote then, please.
Krebitz,
No.
Jagger,
Yes.
Harvey,
Yes.
Herbert,
Yes.
Mackey,
No.
Peters,
Yes.
Pelosa,
No.
Warwick,
No.
Jones.
No.
Motion's defeated.
So I guess I have to entertain a second motion option.
Kravitz, I'd like to number 3, please. As it's worded.
Pelosa will second.
Will second. Any further discussion? Call the vote, please.
Krebitz,
Yes.
Jagger,
Yes.
Harvey,
No.
Herbert,
No, sorry.
Mackey,
Yes.
Peters,
No.
Pelosa,
Yes.
Warwick,
Yes.
Jones.
Yes. The motion's carried. Great discussion, guys. I know it's a hot topic and with a lot of issues at play, but thank you for the discussion.
Mr. Chair, it's Peters here. I had let Elizabeth know that I have to leave at 12:30, so I'm going to have to vacate this meeting.
Okay, well, that's fine. Thank you, Steve.
Okay,
great day.
have a good day, everyone. Thank you.
Okay, we'll move down to, pardon me, item D, coastal risk assessment. Go ahead, Elizabeth. Oh,
Mr.
Joe's
Chair,
doing
yeah,
that.
Mr. Chair, Joe's taking this forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The purpose of this report is to update members on a recent Port Stanley coastal risk assessment that was completed by the municipality of Central Elgin. The primary purpose for initiating this study was to assess the potential coastal hazards affiliated with the Port Stanley Harbor as the municipality is currently working through a secondary plan. As part of that process, the study also looked at updating all of the lake levels since the last study that was completed and considering climate change impacts, as that is now a requirement under the 2020 provincial policy statement. KCCA staff were involved in the technical review team along with the municipality in the development of this final results of this study. There are certain action items that come out of this study that require consideration of Kettle Creek Conservation Authority as a result of our natural hazards core mandated programs. Recognizing time, I'm not going to focus on the presentation for the Port Stanley Harbor. What I can confirm is that hazard lines have been established. There are recommendations for long-term mitigation and improvements to the revetment in the Kettle Creek quay walls, but there's nothing that's a showstopper or of significant concern that wouldn't support the advancement of the Port Stanley secondary plan. If I could have the next slide, please. I recognize that the advanced report didn't have a lot of content from staff's perspective, primarily due to the timing, as this report was just recently considered by Central Elgin Council at their Monday night meeting. I can confirm that the motion that was in the staff report, the Central Elgin staff report in your advanced package, was carried by Central Elgin Council, so they have adopted this report. They have directed staff to consider the mitigation measures and how that'll be implemented on public lands and report back to the municipality. And they've directed staff to notify the results of this report to this board today. So we're bringing this forward now for consideration. With the study being completed, they updated new flood hazard mapping for the flood hazard area of Lake Erie within Port Stanley. If I can have the next slide, please. This is the motion that was passed that I just referentially referred to. And if I could have the next slide, please. What staff have identified as 4 categories of interest of the Kettle Creek Conservation Authority with regard to our natural hazards mandate is we've seen an increase in the 100-year static lake level, which is creating a new flooding hazard in Port Stanley. The results of this study has resulted in increased flood depths within the area of the flood uprush area. That has raised some access egress concerns or impacts, and as well as some new information that needs to be considered within the authority's flood forecasting and warning impacts. I have a few slides that I'll go through each of those to explain what those impacts are. If I could have the next slide, please. So in this map figure, recognizing the climate change impacts on static lake levels, based on several studies that have been done at the federal level with Environment and Climate Change Canada, as well as Intergovernmental Policy Panel. They are predicting that we could see higher lake levels as high as 0.3 meters above the current 100-year static lake level, based on global warming, with a suggested increase of 1.5 to 2% degree in Celsius increase. What that results is that we could see the lake level just higher than 0.35 meters higher than what was experienced in 2019 when we saw record lake level conditions in Port Stanley. Due to the elevations at the end of William Street, we would see lake level flooding, flooding out areas of William Street, Bessie, and Maud, shown in this map in the red hatched area. So this would just be a standard static lake level without any storm influences or wave energy that we could see increased flooding up through portions of the developed area in Port Stanley. If I could have the next slide, please. Within the report, they do offer some mitigation measures that could be established to mitigate that 100-year static lake flooding by establishing a dune at the very south end of William Street. And this would be consistent with a dune management project that Central Elgin has worked on just to the west in that photograph there. This is an action item that would be required of the municipality as it's initiated on public lands and would be there to mitigate that potential static lake level flooding. If I could have the next slide, please. Based on our current practices for flood hazards in Port Stanley, this is the map that was established as part of the 1996 study. And the floodplain, or the Lake Erie flood uprush, is based on an elevation of 176.8. As you can see in this map, the flood uprush area has been divided into 3 zones where we have certain construction standards that are different for each section of those zones that are in place of the flood uprush area. If I could have the next slide, please. As you can see here in the new mapping that was produced with climate change, the horizontal distance of the flood uprush, being that light blue line, hasn't changed very much due to the topography in Port Stanley. Basically, just north of that light blue line, we've got vegetated slopes and an incline. So the topography doesn't support the flood uprush from going any further. In terms of new areas, we see a little bit over in Zone D, up around the lift bridge, where we would see some increased minor flooding across the roadway there. But ultimately, the extent of the flood hazard limit is just slightly modified in Zone D, but relatively consistent in the other areas. This map is showing the light blue line is the ultimate flood uprush hazard limit. The yellow line represents the dynamic beach hazard, and the black line represents the 100-year static lake level. As part of this, when we recognize the 0.35 meter increase in lake levels and also some factual information on increased wave energy, we actually see higher flood elevations in this area. So to date, we rely on 176.8. Based on this study, when we look at zones A to D, we see an increase of 1.3 meters down to 1.4 meters. So basically, the higher flood elevations we see in the area to the west for zone A would be a concern if that was a developed area, but that currently is an area with no development or any future plans for development. But overall, the majority of development through zone B, we're probably looking at an average of 0.5 meters or 0.7 meters of a flood increase. And what that does then is it creates some further restrictions that may have to be considered in how the authority manages redevelopment or new development in those areas, recognizing the higher flood standards that would be required for or to be incorporated into any design of new buildings or structures in that area. If I could have the next slide, please. One recommendation that was noted in the report is that due to the significant amount of beachfront that is in Port Stanley, there is the potential to incorporate a dune development across the entire beach that would in essence alleviate any of the flood risks that would be up into the development areas of Port Stanley. The dune development, if continuous across the beach, would mitigate that flood uprush from reaching development areas. Obviously, something of this nature is a challenge as it results total buy-in by multiple private landowners and public. And there have been expressed concerns in the past when the municipality attempted to put in dunes on other areas of the beaches. So although this is an opportunity, it's a challenging process to have it come to fruition for the long term, but certainly there's benefits to existing landowners to consider site-specific dune management processes to help mitigate flood and other aspects with their development, existing development in that area. If I could have the next slide, please. The third category is with the increased flood elevations, it does raise some concerns with access egress requirements. So under the provincial policy statement for natural hazards, we need to consider that any new development would have safe access and egress to and from that development in the event of a flood event. So for emergency services or for evacuation plans. If we could just have the next slide. With this area of Port Stanley along Edith Cavell, these are the areas of the lowest elevation of the roadway. So the road actually gets lesser elevations as it goes from west to east. Within this stretch, we would see potential floodwaters in excess of 1 meter, which would be some concern to public safety for access egress out of the village for the existing development down along Edith Cavell. If I could have the next slide. We have been in preliminary discussions with the municipality where we have identified that there is potential to incorporate an emergency egress route. That vacant land there where the yellow line goes through is actually owned by the municipality and is used for parking and would very easily be able to set up access through First Street and out through Erie Street. So again, there is mitigation potential here for the municipality to consider to address this access egress issue. And next slide. Also at the end of the west end of Edith Cavell, where there's a cluster of cottages, there's no vehicular way through those cottages, but there is pedestrian access. So the development area in that area also has a pedestrian egress option to evacuate the area in the event we see those significant flood events and escape the area via walking out through that corridor over to West Edith Cavell Boulevard. Next slide, please. The final impact, and again, just I guess referencing that the ability to do dune management would also help alleviate some of the egress access events in terms of a flood event. Next slide, please. And then the final impact to the authorities' core mandated programs is all of the hazard mapping that we have developed to date and through this study looks at that 100-year standard. So that 1% of any given year that we could reach those extreme flood level events. When it comes to our flood forecasting and monitoring program, we have a Port Stanley Lakeshore flooding lookup tables. These tables are used where we can do a mathematical equation based on existing lake levels, wind direction forecasts, wave energy, and different aspects like that. So we can predict how far up the lake uprush would come up during lesser storm events. And then we can advise and warn residents to where we believe that flood uprush extent will go. As part of this study, there are new factors that have been concluded. We're looking at the last 25 years of data that suggests there are historical records of higher wave energies and different things like that, as well as the increased lake levels that would require us to consider updating these flooding lookup tables to be reflective of the new information that's been presented in the coastal hazards assessment. So next steps for the authority, if I could have next slide, please. Some considerations that the authority needs to consider is one is supporting and assisting the municipality of Central Elgin on those required proposed flood hazard mitigations in order to mitigate flood risks to existing development and to consider future development within the flood uprush area. Staff is recommending that there's a need to update our development policies for that area, and we'd like to develop a new development guideline policy for coastal flooding hazards within Port Stanley, resulting from the increased risks of climate change, which would ultimately inform decisions of KCCA on its core mandated natural hazard programs. To date, there's always been an importance and an education awareness program on dune management across the beach, but we don't have necessarily the tools for staff to use to educate landowners as to what are opportunities and constraints on the beachfront that we can continue to try and promote and maintain dune management as flood mitigation. So as part of the development guideline policies, we'd like further guidance on ways to promote and educate landowners on the importance of establishing a dune management plan. And if we can work with individual landowners on a property by property basis, then the potential to establish that continuous dune management plan across the entire beach may be something that is achievable in the future. And then finally, we need to update the Port Stanley flood lookup tables to recognize the new data coming out of this study. Moving forward, it is the intention of staff that we'd be recommending to the board that we retain a qualified professional in coastal engineering to assist us in developing those guidelines and dune management practices. And then, of course, looking at the flooding lookup tables to incorporate the new information that would be needed to improve our flood forecasting and warning programs. It is our intention, we've had discussions with the municipality that if we were to, subject to the board's approval, if we were to move ahead with these studies and the professional consultant, that we would maintain the technical review team. So the municipality staff would continue to participate with KCCA in developing these development policies, in hopes that we would have a consistent approach to natural hazards development in the flood uprush area between the Conservation Authority and the municipality. There is some existing funding within the 2021 budget that could be allocated to achieve this goal. I think with that, I would refer to Elizabeth. Maybe she could speak further to the funding that's available within the current budget. But ultimately, if I could get the next slide, what we're looking for consideration of the board this morning is for the board to endorse the Port Stanley Coastal Risk Assessment Report dated June 3rd, 2021. And then in accordance with KCCA's purchasing policy, staff be directed to retain a qualified professional to assist with development of the following with 2021 expenditures not to exceed available budget funds. So we'd be developing new development guidelines for coastal flooding hazards in Port Stanley, a dune management and best practices guide, and updating KCCA's Port Stanley flooding lookup tables. And maybe if I could, Elizabeth, if you could speak to the budget that's available, that might be interest to the board.
Mr. Chair, to the members, yeah, we had set aside some money based on the National Disaster Mitigation funding proposals that we had presented to the province and the federal government. We had set aside money both for the floodplain mapping down in Port Stanley. We were successful on that project, but unsuccessful on the project that we had set aside for the flood forecasting modeling. And so it'd be my proposal that we would use those funds and direct them to this project and get this as much of this that we can undertake with those available funds this year.
Okay, any questions for Joe or Elizabeth? I know with the experience that most people don't like to do stuff until they get their toes wet, and then we want to fix things. Dominique, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, this study has elements of deja vu, so I want to make sure that as a board, we have the opportunity to apply, do our due diligence and apply duty of care. And I don't see anything that is time sensitive in terms of, endorsing this today. And so it would be my recommendation that we defer these motions until I see at least 4 pieces to me that as a board we need to apply our due diligence. First, the regulations we discussed earlier are not finalized. And it is my understanding, based on the commentary so far, that there's not total consensus even on some of the concepts that are being utilized in this study, whether it's uprush or shoreline protection. And so I think the board should wait until before we develop policies or we direct staff to develop policies, wait until we actually have a finalized set of regulations from the ministry. Secondly, I think we need the opportunity to have a presentation from consultants to the board, so the board can have this study being fully presented and give the opportunity to the board to ask questions. I know I have lots of questions, and just some of the little things that I noticed that they beg discussion. I think everyone appreciates that in this area of study, like many other study, not all engineers agree on the data itself, let alone the interpretation of the 100-year, plans mean. So I think this is one consultant's report, and as a board, we need the opportunity to have a discussion with Mr. Zuzak. Number 3, I also want to ensure that we're consistent with our own practices and policies. My understanding is that when we accept engineers' studies and reports from a third party that we did not hire or select, we do not have in-house the technical expertise to fully examine those studies, and we usually request a peer review. I would love to have a second opinion on many components that are being suggested here. There's not consensus out there on sand dunes and how they work. And so before we can even develop best practices, the board, I think, needs to be informed on some of the debates out there on some of the mitigation strategies and the solutions. And we need to hear second opinions like we would, with us going to the doctors, or as opposed to immediately. So I just hope everybody appreciates, and there is, I want to be careful that if we don't do a peer review, what does that do then on when we consider permit applications and we insist on peer reviews because we don't have the in-house expertise. And I think Joe already mentioned that I certainly would like a more fulsome, less rushed report from staff that would inform the board on all the implications of this study, and us as a board endorsing it. So I'd love a legal commentary, a commentary from input from reactions from the public. So in other words, a more fulsome report from staff and more information on the implications as to what we would be endorsing. So I would move that we defer the adoption of this report until those 4 items have been addressed: final regulations, presentation and discussion with the consultant, results of a peer review, and a fulsome report by staff.
Okay, thank you, Dominique. Further comments? Go ahead, Allison.
Thank you. I just, listening to Dominique, I was just wondering, Dennis, as far as Central Elgin goes, was Mr. Zuzik on hand to present the report that evening for your municipality, or how did that come across?
No, he did not present the report. The report was just given to us, and we adopted the report in principle. And what we're doing going forward, we're having a report coming back to council in regards to the dune and the dune management. And that's at that point, we're going to make a decision at that point. But the climate change, this is based on climate change. And that was the reason we had to do this with our secondary plan, harbor secondary plan that we're endorsing. We had concerns about flooding on the berm area. So that's where this initiated this report. And then it took into the entire area of the region. And as the one slide was presented, the red hatched area that shows the static lake level, the 100-year static lake level at the 0.3 meter due to climate change, this was our greatest concern. So the dune management came into place, but we have not received a presentation from Mr. Zuzik. I do like the Dominique's idea of having Mr. Zuzik to give this board a report for a better understanding, because it's kind of an area specific report. So I would endorse that, but I think this is something we do have to pursue faster than, to drag this on over a course of months and months. So as far as Dominic's suggestion, that is one suggestion that I would endorse, is having Mr. Zuzik report to the board.
Thank you, Dennis. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair. Regarding Dominic's suggestion about a peer review, what is the process for us to have this a peer review done? Would we have to tender that out to other coastal engineers, or is there somebody, like, how would we go about having that done, and how long would that take? Just thinking about Dennis's comment about timeline.
If I may, through you, Mr. Chair, to answer Bill's questions. In this situation, the municipality, the study was initiated and led by the municipality of Central Elgin. As Dennis mentioned, to support the harbor secondary plan. Central Elgin Council did endorse this report, as Dennis mentioned, and with direction to staff to report back on municipal mitigation measures. KCCA staff were involved in that process as a technical review team. So if it came down to an interest of having it peer reviewed, I imagine that cost, time, and lead would be done by the Conservation Authority for our own purposes and recognition of consideration of this board to implement it. So that would require following our purchasing policies to obtain 3 quotes and go through a normal process of retaining someone and subject to their availability to review and report and present back. So in terms of timelines, I wouldn't be able to predict exactly what that would be, as it would be subject to the availability of the consultants that would offer that service.
So Joe, they wouldn't have to go out and do a lot of field work. They would just review the report as it exists, you think, or?
Yeah, a typical peer review is more of a desktop exercise to review the data that's coming in to ensure that it's been properly assessed and factored and that everything was considered. One benefit we have is a lot of these studies are guided by provincial technical guides. So it's not necessarily the consultant running off on their own way. They're following a template or a guide that's been developed by the province. So I don't imagine it's an onerous task, but it would be a financial cost and some time commitment in order to pursue that avenue.
Yeah, I would support the motion with the addition of a peer review as Dominic suggested. Thank you.
I guess my concern is the cost. I know we've had to do a couple peer reviews in the past. Any idea of the cost of that peer review? Because obviously we have a budget to adhere to, and that possibly could affect the budget and how long we have to delay it and go to a second budget. And the increase of levy is always a concern as well. Any comment, any idea what a cost would be for peer review, Joe?
Unfortunately, Mr. Chair, no, I wouldn't know what that cost would be until we develop what the terms of that peer review is and get some responses from consultants.
Go ahead, Dominique.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, I just want to emphasize the consistency. When we insist on peer reviews on landowners, we don't seem to have a regard for cost. So I want to make sure that we don't suddenly introduce a new reason not to do a peer review. And I'm not sure I understand the timing. The intent is not to drag this on for months and months. The intent is to do due diligence, and we take the time that it takes. And I think we do that again for other permit reviews and so on. So those are my additional comments.
If I may, Mr. Chair, in response, just for clarification, when it comes to policy and staff's previous direction or recommendations for peer review, we don't peer review all technical information that comes in. It's typically when there is a discrepancy between what is being recommended relative to what the provincial technical guidelines are suggesting, or whether there's some question relative to the information that's being presented that's above and beyond the expertise of staff. So very rarely do we do request peer reviews. There are situations where those unfortunate circumstances arise where we do. In this situation, staff are confident in the information that's been presented, but with that being said, if it's the will of the board to have it peer reviewed to validate that information, then that's the will of the board. With regard to timelines, the only other thing I would emphasize is when we deal with natural hazards management and development, the authority is assuming some level of liability. We now have new information presented before us. If the report is to be delayed in terms of adoption, then my understanding, and I'd be seeking direction from the board, would be in the interim, then we would still be referring to the 1996 study and the flood elevations that are there. So there is a bit of assuming liability in the fact that if we continue to operate under the older data for development pressures and the new data information does, for instance, if we do get that 1% chance in any given year of a flood hazard and we haven't considered flood mitigation to the standard of the new information, then there is a bit of liability exposure there as well. But just for clarification.
Joe, go ahead, Allison.
Sorry, Allison, you're on mute.
Sorry. I knew that was going to happen today at some point. I just not comfortable delaying too much when Central Elgin has already adopted this, and I think that, you know, we're supposed to be working in partnership with the municipalities to be able to achieve what they're trying to do here with the flood management and the different plans they have. I just don't want to stand in the way of this because I think they have more skin in the game than us. And I don't see the report as not being fulsome. I think it's an up-to-date snapshot of what's happening, and I'm not sure why we'd want to delay that.
Thank you, Allison. Go ahead, Dominique.
Yeah, just an additional commentary in terms of liability. I think we can look at it two ways. There's liability on using older data. There's liability in using non-peer reviewed data. So, and in terms of cost, we know that in the past, I mean, we've encountered lots of legal costs when studies were not peer reviewed. I'll use that term, or double check. Some of the facts in the studies are not double checked. Just Central Elgin selected the consultant. They took responsibility. I know we were part of the technical review, but it's their report. And I would want this board to have the opportunity to ask all of our own questions and not just take another body's, process. I don't believe there was a competitive process even in selecting this consultant. So I would have a question as to why this particular view, because as I mentioned before, different consultants have different views and different recommendations, which would influence our policy. So as a board, I'm not talking about dragging this on forever. I'm talking about doing our due diligence. We do this for our financial statements. We take the time to invite the auditor, they present, we ask questions. So to me, it's our duty. That's why we are here as a board. It's not to delay, it's to apply duty of care, protect ourselves against later costs, more costs probably than a peer review. The peer review could be limited to specific areas of the report where there is a lack of consensus in the field. And so we could get a second opinion. So we could limit it to areas where we're more vulnerable to be challenged if we develop policies that are based on those more questionable areas. So I think, again, this is our role: duty of care, due diligence. And this would be the goal of what I'm recommending.
Go ahead, Dennis.
I just wanted to say, the report that was done, it was done by Peter Zuzak, who has done an extensive amount of work for Chatham-Kent, our neighboring municipality, where there is flooding that has occurred in the Erio area, where the municipality is now being taken to court and not using the updated data. There's even evidence within the report showing the conservation in the Wheatley area, where the roadway has eroded due to the climate change. And the climate change is something that made this report a necessary report. And what Kettle Creek is doing, we're developing guidelines on the hazards, like the dune management practices. These are not items that are causing a liability to the Conservation Authority. I think if anything, by not adopting this and starting to work on these new programs, we are creating liability by not doing this at this time. So just in closing, that's all I'd like to say about that. Thank you.
If I may, Mr. Chair, the only other thing I'd add in terms of I certainly understand Dominique's comments on the recommendations. In terms of the technical data that was used to determine the 0.35 meter increase on climate change type considerations falls out of subsequent studies that are being done by several federal government studies. So the study refers to Upper Great Lakes study, Environment Climate Change Canada study and results, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and as well as the Canada Climate Change Report. So all of the facts on what's being predicted with a 0.35 meter increase and the results of climate change and how that's going to impact these hazards was all taken from studies that are done with joint commissions of the US and Canada dealing with the Great Lakes. And then how we determine the uprush factors and wave energy and things like that are all based on the technical guidelines of MNRF through the Great Lakes technical guide that was developed in 2001. So certainly the technical data is the science, and it's been determined based on several levels of government who established that. And the protocols of how we determine a flooding hazard are all outlined for implementation of the provincial policy statement by MNR through several technical guide documents that are in place today.
Okay, great debate. We have some recommendations before you.
So Mr. Chair, just a point of order, there is a motion. I have put a motion on the table, so I think we need a seconder at this point.
You're correct. I forgot you did take a motion. So we need a seconder to Dominique's 4 points. Second call for a seconder. Seeing no seconder.
Just a point of clarification, the seconder doesn't need to be in favor of the motion if anyone is hesitant because of that.
Still see no seconder. So the recommendation is still there before you. I do like the idea of hearing the report from the gentleman in person at some point. I think Dennis also indicated that he would like to hear that. So maybe we could ask the gentleman to attend a meeting at some future meeting. Added to the recommendation.
So, Mr. Chair, I would be willing to amend my motion and to that we defer adoption of this report of the study until the board has had a presentation and a discussion with Mr. Susek. And I think the other points could be reconsidered in terms of the need for peer review and additional reports from staff after we've had a discussion and the opportunity to questions of Mr. Susek. So the motion is to defer the adoption of this report until such a time as the board has had a full presentation and discussion with Mr. Susek.
Okay. Need a seconder for that motion? Call for a seconder. No bites. Dominique. So the resolution is still before you, recommendation. I have suggested we ask gentlemen to attend a future meeting.
So, Mr. Chair, just as a point of clarification or order, so we need to dispose of the motion somehow, right? Do we not need a seconder just to proceed? And then even if we
No, I think
defeat
your
the
motion
motion?
fails. When you don't have a seconder, your motion fails, Dominique.
Okay, that's fair.
So
I was asked for a motion be presented, whether it's the one in front of you or an amended motion.
I would move as it's in front of us to go ahead with the 3 recommendations. And I also would be in favor of Mr. Susek, but I'm not prepared to defer it until we have Mr. Susek in front of us.
Mr. Kravitz, I would second that motion.
So Jim? was it?
No, I was going to second it because I think the point is we want to meet with Mr. Zevitz. So, but to make it a motion to have it done, I don't think it's necessary. You've already addressed it, Mr. Chair, that you'll ask him to attend a meeting. And I'd like to see these things start moving forward. It's a credible report and I don't think we should be delaying it. But anyway, I'm happy to support the motion that's just been put on the floor.
Thank you, Jim. Any further discussion? See no further discussion. Call the vote, please, Elizabeth.
So just so I'm clear, it was moved by Allison, seconded by Jim Herbert, the motion on screen. Dennis Kravitz,
Yes.
Jagger,
No,
Herbert,
Yes.
Mackey,
Yes.
Pelosa,
Yes.
Warwick,
Yes.
Jones,
Yes.
and that motion passes, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for the discussion, everyone. So the next report's also from Joe, planning regulations for June.
Mr. Chair, just,
Sorry.
I'm sorry, I need to verify that we still have quorum. Bill has indicated that he has to leave after this motion, and so has Elizabeth. We are in danger of losing quorum with those 2 members leaving. I need to do a roll call just to ensure that we have quorum, and if Allison or if Elizabeth and Bill are still on the line, if we could just get through Joe's staff report, we could delay the reports in the closed session until August if necessary.
I will stay, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Okay, go ahead, Joe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the planning and regulations report summary, it was outlined in your advanced packages. Staff's just looking for receipt of that information, and I'm happy to answer any questions of the members.
Questions for Joe on the report? See no questions, recommendation, the June planning, 21 planning and regulations activity report be received. Mover and seconder, please.
Elizabeth will move it. Pelosi?
Seconder, Herbert,
Herbert will second.
call vote, please.
Kravitz,
Yes.
Jiguer,
Yes,
Herbert,
Yes,
Jones,
Yes.
Mackey, I believe, has left. Pelosi,
Yes.
Warwick,
Yes.
What is it, buddy?
and that motion passes.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Okay, that's the end of the full authority meeting. We've lost quorum. Leave.
If Elizabeth is leaving, we have lost quorum.
So we'll have to defer closed session to the next full authority meeting. So just motion to adjourn.
At this time, I'll send out the doodle poll for the next meeting. You can see that coming up, and then we'll post the decided meeting publicly once it's decided.
Herbert will move for adjournment.
Okay. Seconder,
second.
Warwick. Call the vote, please, Elizabeth.
I'm assuming everyone present is in favor of that, and I appreciate your patience and moving your schedules to accommodate an 11 o'clock start.
Yeah,
That was a good meeting today, Mr. Chair.
yeah, thank you. I do thank you also for your indulgence of moving the meeting ahead. Unfortunately, it crunched into some other people's time. All right, meeting's adjourned.